Welcome back to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, in fact, the Masked Mormon. Why am I wearing a mask? Well,
were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
I'm excited and a little angered by today's topic. But before I get into it, if you like what I do here, press that like and subscribe button. Today, we're talking about tithing. A defining feature of Mormon church services is that they do not send a collection plate around the congregation to gather donations. Instead, members donate discreetly to the church via these small envelopes. This and the Spartan nature of Mormon church buildings and minimalistic church services gives the impression that the church isn't about money. Church educational materials will also tout the volunteer nature of its lay clergy. It is a fact that local leadership receive no monetary compensation for the time they put into their church responsibilities. I emphasize the word local because the top leadership do in fact get paid. In fact, local members will literally put tens of hours every week and time away from their families to fill the various needs of the local congregation. This includes everything from teaching to pastoral care, administrative responsibilities, cleaning church buildings, and so much more. However, the church doesn't run on prayers and good intentions. Just like everything else in the world, it requires money. And you can buy anything in this world with money. And the church, like any other church, gets its money from its members in the form of tithing. The history of tithing is just about as long as the history of the church itself. I might even go over it in a future video, but today I want to focus on how tithing affects modern members of the church. In the church's own General Handbook of Instructions, it tries to keep tithing as simple as possible by stating, the simplest statement we know of is the statement of the Lord himself, namely, that the members of the church should pay 1/10 of all their interest annually, which is understood to mean income. No one is justified in making any further statement than this. That seems simple enough. But on reflection, there can be quite a bit of ambiguity about what interest annually, or even income, actually means. The corporate church tries to say that it is a personal decision between the member and the Lord about how much they should pay. They will, however, say tithing should be done above all other financial responsibilities. In fact, in recent General Conference addresses and in teachings to members in developing nations, there have been things like this said. If a destitute family is faced with the decision of paying their tithing or eating, they should pay their tithing. If you're faced with the decision of paying your tithing or eating, pay your tithing. Okay. In April of 2017, Valerie Cordon said, after some events related to a civil war in Central America, my father's business went bankrupt. He went from about 200 full-time employees to fewer than 5 sewing operators who worked as needed in the garage of our home. One day, during those difficult times, I heard my parents discussing whether they should pay tithing or buy food for the children. On Sunday, I followed my father to see what he was going to do. After our church meetings, I saw him take an envelope and put his tithing in it. The question that remained for me was, what were we going to eat? In December 2012, Aaron West said, if paying tithing means that you can't pay for water or electricity, pay tithing. If paying tithing means that you can't pay your rent, pay tithing. Even if paying tithing means that you don't have enough money to feed your family, pay tithing. In a visit to Kenya, Russell Nelson, the president of the church, said, we preach tithing to the poor people of the world because the poor people of the world have had cycles of poverty generation after generation. That same poverty continues from one generation to another until people pay their tithing. So, you pay your tithing before you feed your children, or any of your bills, and you pay tithing to get out of poverty? That's interesting. Paying tithing must be pretty important if you need to do it before taking care of your family. What does the church do with all this money? Well, they pay for chapels, temples, utilities, and various administrative costs. This sounds pretty reasonable. The church was once on shaky financial ground, and in the mid-20th century, it started calling adept business leaders into the highest echelons of leadership. The church started investing what was left over from the church's operating costs, investing in stocks, real estate, and so much more. Due to sound financial choices, the church has amassed well over
$100 billion.
Now, I don't fault the church for frankly making sound financial decisions and seeing some great growth. The church has more money than God.
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship?
I do find fault with the church doing this at the expense of its members. I also find fault with requiring tithing to be paid as a requirement for members to enter the temples. You see, Mormons believe that saving ordinances that can connect families together forever in the highest kingdom of heaven occur within the temples. If you don't pay tithing, you are not considered worthy to enter the temple, and thus may not be worthy to be saved with your family in this highest kingdom of heaven. This can kind of sound like a ransom with a veiled threat. Even more disturbing yet is how the church has twisted the teachings of previous leaders to fit its purposes. In 1899, a church leader named Lorenzo Snow said, "I plead with you in the name of the Lord, and I pray that every man, woman, and child who has means shall pay 1/10 of their income as tithing." Yet, in a manual about Lorenzo's teachings, it states, "I plead with you in the name of the Lord, and pray that every man, woman, and child shall pay 1/10 of their income as tithing." Did you catch that? Here, let me put up this graphic. Those three little dots are called an ellipsis. It means something was left out of a quote, usually something that may not be important. That little exclusion completely changes the meaning of Lorenzo's statement. It appears Lorenzo did not see tithing as something the destitute should be paying. What can make it even more damaging is how the cultural church reinforces and adds on to these teachings. It has all kinds of things to say about what should be tithed, how much, etc. It will say that tithing is like fire insurance that will save the member from burning at the second coming. Yikes. But the cultural teaching I want to focus on is about what should be tithed. Because tithing is considered 1/10 of our income, we should probably understand what income is. Culturally, most Mormons will pay tithing either on their gross or before taxes or on their net after tax income. And because it is so much more fun to make up extra rules or shame other members for not doing things right, the following couplet has been thrown around in many Sunday school classes. Do you want net blessings or gross blessings? Because apparently God is very transactional. Mormonism is very much a prosperity gospel, meaning if you do some task or pay some amount, God will bless you in kind, and if you don't, God will curse you. So, it's a law, but also a free will offering? Tithing is taught as simple and fair. God gives you everything, and all he asks in return is 10%. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you pay the same percentage. So let's talk taxes for a little and see how that affects people making different amounts of money. Because if you are especially astute, you will realize 10% for a poor person is very different than 10% for a rich person. The United States, where I live, has a notoriously complex and convoluted tax code. When it comes to income tax, on a basic level, it is a progressive tax broken up into income brackets. A progressive tax means that lower income earners are charged less in taxes, percentage-wise, than richer earners. Contrary to popular belief, if If you are in a 22% tax bracket, it does not mean that your entire income is taxed at 22%. Instead, your income is broken up into buckets. Each bucket is taxed at a different rate. For a person that is married, filed jointly, the first 3 tax brackets or buckets are shown. These are based on 2020 numbers. Your first $19,750 is taxed at 10%. The next $60,500 is taxed at 12%, and then the next $90,800 is taxed at 22%. Sorry if this is a lot of numbers. However, each American taxpayer gets a certain amount of income that is considered essentially tax exempt. This is called the standard deduction. If you itemize your taxes, you can choose between the standard deduction or your itemized deductions. For that person who is married, filing jointly, the standard deduction is $24,800. Your taxable income is then determined by subtracting your pre-tax income from the standard deduction. So if you make, for example, $50,000 pre-tax, your taxable income is $50,000 minus the $24,800, or $25,200. That taxable income is what's broken up into the buckets or tax brackets. So let's run through a couple of examples. So taking that $50,000 example, the first $19,750 is taxed at 10%, or $1,975. The rest is taxed at 12%, or $654, for a total federal income tax of $2,629. Something else that affects this is the FICA tax, aka Social Security and Medicare taxes. This is 7.65% of your gross earnings, or $3,825. So, out of your $50,000 pre-tax income, you actually get to take home $43,546. This, of course, excludes any state or local taxes that may also be taken out, or any benefits that are provided by your employer. But 13% ends up going to various federal taxes. So now you have to pay your tithing. We will go through the gross and net tithing models. With your take home of $43,546, you end up with about $3,600 a month. Your gross tithing is going to be $5,000 a year, or about $416 a month. So you actually end up with $38,546 a year, or about $3,200 a month. So you go from making $50,000 a year down to $38,000 a year, all before you have even paid to meet your family's basic needs. If you add all that tithing up over 30 years, you end up paying $150,000 to the church. The church ends up adding that money to its enormous hoard it already does nothing with. What could you do with that money? Possibilities are endless. But let's say you do the responsible thing and invest it. If you instead invest that $5,000 a year for 30 years in a mutual fund with a super conservative 5% return rate, you would end up with $353,800. Wow! The church wouldn't even notice such a small amount. A half-point change in a stock would dwarf your contribution. But you could do a lot with that. Now, if instead you pay on net, you end up paying about $4,354 a year, or about $362 a month. So your take-home is slightly higher at $39,191 a year, or about $3,200 a month. This is $130,638 over 30 years that you end up giving to the church. Again, if instead you invest your annual tithing in the same mutual fund for 30 years, you end up with $308,134. The monthly tithing is a pretty decent car payment, or grocery bill, or even a decent portion of rent or mortgage. Tithing is a compulsory, voluntary donation. If you are the master of your finances, you might realize that in a tight time, $5,000 a year is too much to save. You would have the latitude to choose to save or invest a different amount. But if you want to attend the temple, see a child be sealed, or whatever, tithing is non-negotiable. Now let's say you hustle and get promoted or find a better job. Now you're making $75,000 a year. With your standard deduction, your taxable income is now $50,200 a year. The first $19,750 is still taxed at 10%, or the same $1,975. Now you have $30,450 taxed at 12%, or $3,654. This gives a federal income tax of $5,629. Now, with $5,737 in FICA taxes, you end up taking home $63,633, with 15% going to various federal taxes. Now, you go to pay gross tithing because, of course, you want gross blessings. With $7,500 a year in tithing, that is $625 a month. Just think about what you could do with $625 a month. So you end up taking home after tithing $56,133 a year, or about $4,600 a month. That is $225,000 over 30 years that you end up paying to the church. Investing that instead in the same mutual fund with the same 5% returns would return $530,000, over $500,000. If instead you're a little lacking in faith and decide to pay on net, that is $6,363 a year in tithing, or $530 a month. Over 30 years, that is $190,900 given to the church. Again, if it was instead invested, you would turn that into $450,275. Again, I ask, what could you do with $500,000 after 30 years? Anything you want. I know that was a lot of numbers, but I hope those examples really brought home how much tithing costs a member. I didn't even account for inflation. I don't know if you paid any attention to how much the gross or net tithing is per month. When you take a standard home budget into account, you have to house, feed, clothe, warm, insure, and transport yourself. The amount you would pay month to month is not an insignificant amount. Tithing eats both into your non-discretionary and discretionary income. Tithing eats up so much that fast offerings or other offerings to the poor may fall off to the wayside. That money can take pressure off a family that is stretched thin. It can pay extra bills or help with experiences that might be meaningful to your family. It can give them breathing room that they might need to take a risk on a new business or educational opportunity. It can allow a family to donate to something they feel passionate about. Instead, tithing ends up crushing them unnecessarily. Tithing ends up being something that squeezes the poorer members more than the affluent members. That 10% does more for the less financially well-off members. Tithing is a regressive tax on the poor. To really hit things home, let's look at an extreme example. In physics or engineering, it can often be useful to put extremely large or small numbers into an equation to see how it behaves and get an intuitive sense of what's going on. Let's say, for example, you live in a place with no tax brackets and an extremely high tax rate. Let's say 90%. In our $50,000 a year example, $45,000 a year will go to taxes, leaving you with $5,000 a year to live on. If you pay tithing on gross, the entirety of that $5,000 would go to the church, leaving you with nothing. If you paid on net, you would pay $500 in tithing, leaving you with $4,500 to live on. Again, I know it's extreme, but it shows how different the gross and net models are. So, are there any other models of tithing a person could adopt if they feel the need to pay tithing to the church, beyond the gross or net model? Of course. A person could pay on their surplus. What is this apostasy you're talking about, you may ask? Well, take a business for instance. The money it brings in is its revenue, the gross income or sales. The business then has to pay its expenses, rent, payroll, suppliers, taxes, etc. What's left after all of that is profit, or on a more personal note, your surplus. It takes money to live. There's a certain amount that is non-discretionary. Rent, food, utilities, all that kind of stuff. If you pay tithing on what's left over after that, you have a better understanding of if you are living below or above your means. You have a better understanding of your own financial standing. Plus, it's more in line with how tithing was taught early in the church's history. It's also in line with the scriptural accounts like Abraham paying tithes on his spoils, or surplus, to Melchizedek. So how does the church justify this millstone that weighs down the members and monopolizes a huge chunk of their financial resources? Especially with how much it teaches about self-sufficiency? Well, it uses the scriptures, of course. There are several scriptural resources that are trotted out during tithing lessons or talks. There is the one where Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, which I mentioned before. There is the one about the widow's offering of 2 mites as an offering, which, when read in context, is about the scribes devouring the widows' houses and economic oppression being perpetrated by the priesthood class. But the main go-to scripture that gets trotted out during nearly every talk about tithing is, of course, Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. But like often happens, a proof text scripture will be used to make a point, but will often be taken out of context. Reading the whole of the book of Malachi, you have to ask yourself, who is this being written to? Well, Malachi 1:6 makes it clear that it's to the priests. It's the priests who are robbing the temple storehouse and were plundering it. Is this something that the modern church is doing in demanding that tithing be paid even before attending the needs of your own family? These heavy scriptural warnings on top of intense social pressure via the temple recommend can make people afraid not to pay tithing. Teachings have been reiterated that people cannot afford not to pay tithing, that God is waiting to bless or curse you depending on your compliance with the law. So, where does this leave things? Well, if you want to pay your tithing or you feel that you need to, then by all means, pay your tithing. If you need to do it to maintain a status quo, then again, pay your tithing. If paying tithing strengthens you spiritually, then again, pay your tithing. But I think informed consent is necessary to make the best decisions possible. It is important to know what options are available to you so you can make an informed choice. If you want to pay tithing on gross, net, surplus, something else, not at all, know why or have a good reason to do so. Choose it deliberately and independently of familial or church pressure, especially when approaching tithing from a non-orthodox way. Be able to hold your ground when questioned by others that may see things differently. But to those who choose to pay tithing on gross or net, I have this important question. Will the church take care of you when you are old? After a lifetime of paying tithing at the expense of funding your retirement, will the church open its windows and rain down a blessing upon you in your financial need? Or will its leaders demand you continue to pay tithing on your meager Social Security? Will the church squeeze and squeeze until you have nothing left to give?
It's yours to squeeze, as I promised. I want you to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze!
And then blame you and deny you a temple recommend because you are considered unworthy? Unfortunately, I think we all know the answer to that question. We all likely know people in this situation. Sure, there may be an occasional food order or may pay a bill here or there. But why, when the church has so much money already, do they continue to demand its members pay tithing? Well, to be frank, it's too useful a tool to keep people attached to the church. It's a shibboleth. It's a boundary maintenance tool. Sure, the church could get by indefinitely without its members ever paying another cent in tithing. But culturally, the church cannot afford for its people to not tithe anymore. Because temple attendance and tithing are linked, the church has a powerful lever to pull to maintain authority over its people. But I ask again, will the church take care of you after you have sacrificed so much to it? So what do you think? If you have any tithing stories, leave them in the comments, and I may include them in another video where I read your tithing stories. If you like this, press that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.